Greetings and welcome to the students and faculty who are listening to this presentation. Let me introduce myself. My name is Robert Bellinger. I have a master's degree in education and a PhD in history, and am grounded in the discipline of Black Studies. In my 40-plus years of teaching, I have taught every age grade, from preschool through university, and have had the opportunity to teach not only in the United States, but also in Eastern Europe and in West Africa. Today, we are examining the issues, debates, and silences in the representation of Africa in the curriculum. We are also looking at the issues, debates, and silences and how they contribute to educational inequities, and thus why African studies can serve to decolonize education. In my presentation, I will first provide an overview of the discipline of Black Studies and its relevance in the study of Africa. I will talk about some of my research, followed by a few examples of the role Black Studies can play in the process of decolonizing education. I will start by saying Black Studies can be essential to the 21st century curriculum. I say this because Black Studies provides a counterpoint to Eurocentric education. It is the alternative voice. It is the challenge. Secondly, Black Studies is in dialogue with the global Black community, and this leads to exciting new ideas, challenges, and pathways in learning about the human condition. Also, Black Studies is located at the intersection between Black people and their experiences and the world of academia. This is very important because Black Studies provides the opening, the portal, so to speak, of access to the community in a way that respects and recognizes the value of Black people. Now, as we start, it would be good to have a definition of Black Studies. Black Studies is the critical and systematic study of the thought and practice of African people in their current and historical unfolding. This is very, very key. It is looking at Black people over time and in time, at their thoughts, their practices, their ways of knowing and ways of being. There are some very significant terms that come with Black Studies. One is to understand that Black Studies, by its very nature, is Pan-African. It includes all Africans wherever they may be found. It is also, as a discipline, concerned with the abilities and the thoughts of African people, so it puts an emphasis on initiative and agency. It is focusing on the way in which Black people use their capacity and will to make history, create culture, and address critical human concerns in a meaningful and successful manner. This together leads to an African worldview in which the way one looks at the world is reflective of their understanding of Africa. It also provides for an Afrocentric perspective, a view that is centered within the culture in which Africans are the subjects and agents of their own history. It also engages Afrocentricity, placing African ideals at the center of any analysis that involves African culture and behavior. Black Studies is also interdisciplinary by its very nature. It finds space in every academic discipline and utilizes the methods of a comparative history, which allows it to make connections between events, in different parts of the continent, events on the continent, events throughout the diaspora, in different parts of the diaspora, and between Africa and the diaspora. Black Studies, from its birth over 50 years ago, employed an activist scholar model, a model in which the scholar is an activist and the activist is a scholar. It does not separate learning from doing, and one should use their knowledge, the skills that they gained, for the betterment of their communities, and to be actively engaged in the world around them. As such, Black Studies also embraces the concept of Afrofuturism and what it brings to the table. Afrofuturism is at once an intersection of imagination, technology, the future, and liberation. Afrofuturism is a way of imagining possible futures through a Black cultural lens. And it is a way to encourage experimentation, reimagine identities, and activate liberation. These are the goals of Black Studies. Now, my own research that I will talk about today is two particular projects. One, the Gewel Tradition Project. The Gewel Tradition was started about a decade and a half ago. A Gewel is what we in the West usually refer to as a griot, but the Gewel is the Wolof term for it, Wolof being the language of the Senegalese people. Now, the Gewel Tradition Project values the perspective of indigenous people, values the insights and knowledge of traditional culture. When I first began working with the family, they're known as the Sing Sing family, but their surname is Fai. They're the most significant Gewel family in Dakar, West Africa, because they are the family of the chief Gewel, or griot, of Dakar. But when I first began working with them, people at my university asked me, well, what are their credentials? I responded that if someone decided to do a PhD dissertation on their tradition, they would have to go to those people to learn about it. And once they had completed the PhD, they would still only know a fraction of what those people knew. I said, so let's not talk about credentials in the typical way. Let's put value on traditional knowledge and traditional ways of knowing. That allowed me, over 4 years, to bring them to the university as distinguished visiting scholars and to have them as instructors in a class we provided to the university, taught every year. So in that way, it brought traditional knowledge and traditional people into the university, into the world of academia. Part of the time they were there, we also had a 2-month conference where we brought scholars in film, scholars in history. We had demonstrations, we had performances, we had films, all of these things to show the various ways in which traditional African knowledge could inform and shape the academic world. Additionally, I've produced 3 compact discs for the family, representing 3 generations, the youth, the adults, and the elders. I have published articles about the tradition and about the family and about the project in scholarly publications, and have and so that is another way of making that bridge. And presently I am working on books about the traditions and about the family. My second project is in African American foodways. And we all know about the relationship of African food practices and ways of knowing to African American food practices, and thus American food practices. But the latest segment of this is called the African American Heritage Seed Project, which I'm working on with family members and a foundation in Charleston, South Carolina. And what we are doing is we are researching the African and African American horticultural and agricultural knowledge and how that shaped American foodways. The photos here on the left is sesame, a crop that was introduced to North America by Africans. And on the right is rice, another crop that Africans introduced to North America. So that gives you a sense of the way in which we are looking at African and African American foodways and making links between knowledge on the continent and knowledge in the Americas. Now, this leads us to think about what are the challenges that are faced in getting this material into the curriculum. Well, there are three challenges that I'm outlining here. One is the textbook. They're not inclusive, and we know they're problematic, so I'm not going to labor on them. Two, the curriculum is structured from a Eurocentric platform, and this is true in most schools across the globe. And so this is one of the challenges. And the third is that teachers are not prepared or empowered to bring Black studies into the classrooms in many instances. And so these are three areas that make it difficult, challenging to incorporate Black studies. So it requires that an understanding that textbooks cannot be the only source of information, right? We have to use sources, we have to use scholars, we have to perhaps rely on the most recent publications online or otherwise. Two, the curriculum needs rebuilding. And we know this, whether we're talking about Western schools in the U.S. or Europe, or whether we're talking about former colonial schools on the African continent. We know that there needs to be restructuring more than just adding a few people or events here and there. And lastly, teachers need to be differently educated. And this is key. As important as it is to get this information to the youth, what is equally important is that we get this into teacher training programs at graduate and undergraduate levels, because without the teachers, the students don't get the information. This is key. Now, a few examples of the ways in which I have encountered these gaps, these silences, these debates, and the way in which I have tried to address them. The first is from a student in an American university. The student was an international relations major in the government department, and they were from West Africa. I asked them what they were studying in their government class, and they told me the Cold War. I asked what they were learning, and after a 10-minute synopsis of all they had been covering and so forth, I asked the student, I said, well, what about Africa in the Cold War? And after thinking for a few minutes, she responded, I guess Africa was not involved. Now, this took me aback, but it also made me remember a few years earlier when I had taught an American history class in Dakar, Senegal. The approved textbook briefly mentioned Africa during the age of Western imperialism, the late 19th century, when the countries of Europe were dividing Africa between them. The next mention of Africa came with the release of Nelson Mandela in the 1990s. Africa was conspicuously absent throughout the 20th century, especially noticeable during World War II, which was the topic that I was teaching at the time. However, in the textbook there was a chapter on World War II in Europe. So I gave the students the assignment of researching and writing about the role of any African country they chose during World War II. The students were from at least a half dozen different countries, and many of them choose their own country to research. But when I assigned it, one young man raised his hand and I said yes. He said, well, how is this assignment connected to American history? And I explained to him how it was connected, because if Europe was connected to World War, which America is part of the world, then Africa was also connected. And before I could continue, he said, no, I'm not questioning the assignment. I love it. I just wanted to know how you arrived at that. And so I realized these students wanted this. And the assignment led to some amazing discussions, not only about World War II, but about the absence of Africa in Western curriculums. Getting back to the conversation with the student about the Cold War, since I was familiar with her home country, I was able to ask her questions that would help her make connections between the class, the textbook, and what she knew about her own country, her home. This led, as in the earlier instances, to some very interesting discussions about Africa as part of world history, and also about its absence in the curriculum they had been receiving. Another example, often in my classes, particularly those that were about African history or the diaspora or intro to Black Studies, I would always ask the students if they knew who Cheikh Anta Diop was. He was one of the leading intellectuals of the 20th century, and his work in history, linguistics, Egyptology, anthropology, and science laid the foundation for much of what is Black Studies today. But I would ask them, and the most I would get would be, he was a scientist. And this would only happen if I had students from Senegal in the class. If there were no students from Senegal, there was usually no response. But the students from Senegal also could not go beyond that. They did not understand the fullness or the importance of this figure. Now, what was even more disturbing was when I asked this question of students I was teaching in Dakar, Senegal. I couldn't get more than he was a scientist. I might get another couple things, but not much. And the sad thing about it, the school I was teaching at sat on Avenue Cheikh Anta Diop. The university in Dakar is named University Cheikh Anta Diop, but many Senegalese students do not know who he is or why he is significant. Why is there such a gap in their education about an important figure in their own society? The third example comes from several years ago. I attended a conference on Black Studies in Dakar, Senegal. It was a great conference with people from all over the African continent, from the Caribbean, from the U.S. There were some interesting papers. But the most problematic discussions came when one of the local scholars questioned the need for Black Studies and suggested that it was separatist and unnecessary. It was clear that he did not understand or accept Black studies as a discipline. One of his colleagues, another local academic, created a stir when he suggested that the Black Lives Matter movement, because it privileged Black lives, was discriminatory, and that whenever it came up in one of his classes, he would tell his students that all lives matter. This had a strong reaction, but a particularly strong reaction from the graduate students who were there from their studies in various parts of the world. They challenged him and did not accept that point of view. But this is part of the reason for the gap. My final example comes from an opportunity I had to do a presentation to a group of 7th and 8th grade students at a private school in Dakar, Senegal. The school, even though I was invited by a teacher, they were kind of worried about her because she was always providing pro-African information to students. And so we were in a room where there was no projector to run the PowerPoint I had prepared. So I just talked to them about the African diaspora and answered questions that they had along the way. We were in the room for 2 hours, and the students were all engaged and deeply interested. They wanted to know more. They were hungry for this information. So I'm convinced about the importance of Black studies in the 21st century curriculum. I'll just close by saying Black studies is poised to deconstruct the myths about Africa and the diaspora and make connections between those within the continent and those outside of it. As a discipline, it can serve to decolonize and restructure curriculum, both on the continent and outside of it. Thank you for taking time to listen.